Welcome to the Layman Seminary. Today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be working on my paper on 1 Corinthians 15 concerning the gospel. This paper is due in 6 days on the 17th. The last time I touched it was October 24th. See, what I did with at the beginning of the class is I started working on my paper, my assignments real fast, and I worked on my paper, and I kept doing that until it became too much, and then I had to put the paper to the side and focus on making my assignments, which included an outline synthesis of the book of Acts and Paul and so on, as I made other videos on that. And other things got hectic. But regardless of that, so I have to get myself back into the mode of paper writing. So the first thing I did was I ran Grammarly on what I did. Okay. And so that got the spelling, that got a lot of those issues. Didn't get everything because I still didn't worry about passive voice and things like that right now. Then I ran the internal review thing that's in Word, this thing right here. Click on review and then editor. I ran that, and then after that I did word rake, which makes things more concise. And so this paper is supposed to be 10 to 12 pages, and as it stands right now, it's 16 pages. So it's too long. It's not fully ordered. But to motivate me, I'm going to start walking through this paper with y'all and catch what I can catch and change what I can catch, So recording yourself is a good way to motivate you to work on your paper, because if you're talking to somebody else, you get clarity and you actually have to do it instead of just staring at it. So, I mean, I love studying the Bible, but when things are having a deadline or a grade, it's a difficult task. It becomes work at that point. I mean, you can still enjoy that work, but it's challenging. Introduction. Does one have to continue to believe and behave in harmony with the gospel to remain saved or prove that one is truly saved? Or are there other options? While the scope of this paper limits the exploration of all the viable options, I'm going to actually make it possible, not viable. I had it as possible, but one of my things changed it to viable. So they don't like it right now. Feasible, viable, practical options. I just want possible options. For sociological articulations, it will focus on one of the proof texts weaponized by all camps. And I probably need to identify what this passage is at this point. 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 3. So let me just, which is, and you could do namely, which is 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 3. They all observe the key terms and ask the same interpretive questions, yet all do not have the same answer. This paper will argue that the free grace position best answers this question. And so this paper will argue, I have it twice, so I'm going to clean all of this up later, but this paper will argue that this passage discusses the experiential and ultimate gospel and experiential salvation. This paper will argue for a free grace position that best answers these questions. It takes, here, I'll just do this. It takes this passage as discussing the experiential and ultimate gospel and experiential salvation. It's a free grace view because others exist for this passage. So argue for okay, that's basically saying that there's other ways that free grace people can deal with this passage. These would be explored and countered. And I may take the explicit free grace stuff out at the very beginning And this paper will argue that this passage discusses the experiential and ultimate gospel and experiential salvation. Okay. So experiential, ultimate, I would say these terms will be defined as the paper unfolds. And that's probably not going to cut it. If I'm going to make an argument up front, then I need to probably identify things in the beginning. The reason I went ahead and made this argument strictly up front is because there's been other times that I've written papers and I've focused on what I'm doing in the paper. Like I'll say it will compare different passages or view different aspects, but I need to be able to argue for a position. And so I made my position explicit at the very beginning, and I could change that later on. So let's leave this alone for now. The way forward. So we got the introduction, and I'm viewing the way forward as part of that introduction. Yeah, I guess it's fine, but introduction. Okay. If this were an exegetical paper, it would be best to work clause by clause throughout 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 3. But as an expositional paper focusing on sociology, the order of presentation is by answering these questions. First, are the passages written to believers? What does save mean in this passage? What does gospel mean? What does stand mean? What does hold fast mean? What does the conditional clause mean? What does it mean to believe? And what does believing in vain mean? Finally, what is the purpose of this passage? Now, later on, I'll go in and either I'll put these in italics to get these to stand out and things like that, so that people know I'm talking about terms. Okay, answer and interpret the questions for 1 Corinthians 15. Are these passages written to believers, or is this a rhetorical convention? Before diving into the text, the conditionalist position has at least one thing going for it. It typically views the original audience as first saved, in contrast to the Calvinistic leaning that believes that warnings in the book do not refer to believers, but could motivate believers. They believe that being unsure of one's salvation motivates one to serve God. Reformed theology has always argued that the audience comprises the elect and non-elect. Sometimes they point out how the Old Testament theocracy comprised believers and unbelievers, which is true for the visible church. They believe the invisible church includes only the elect, but in their system, the church existed before Acts 2. So there's more I could say, there's less I could say about that, and I just trying to preserve the idea that I have to talk about how they view the church here. The free grace proponent can counter this by saying that the biblical text identifies these audiences as believers, brethren, and other related terms. But the current trend has been to claim that the Bible addresses every audience as if they are already saved, as a rhetorical preaching convention. They argue that as preachers talk to their audience as brethren, but know that everybody in the audience is not saved, the Bible also addresses everyone as believers. Because of the above counter to free grace, the best option is to make Christians aware of these devices and the challenges by free grace of these devices. Bob Wilkin reviewed an article by Andrew J. Wilson, whose 2017 doctoral dissertation was on the warning assurance relationship in 1 Corinthians. Wilson argues that God leaves a believer unsure of one's salvation to motivate service to him. One of the most recent commentaries, the ESV Expository Commentary 2020, depends on the 2017 argument of Wilson. Another Calvinist, Patrick Schreiner, appears to use a device when he argues, a rescue device, when he argues that Paul uses phenomenological language, and by that he means that people are addressed as saved because they appear to be. But if they don't persevere until the end of their life, it proves they were never saved. D.A. Carson's work inspired this approach in 1992, probably inspired this approach. In 1992, Reflections on Christian Assurance, which is often quoted by recently reformed commentaries. That article counters the Grace Evangelical Society's interpretations. In 1993, Zane Hodges responded to Carson's article in a series titled The New Puritanism. Jody Dillow of the Free Grace Alliance also exposes the presuppositions of Carson in his chapter for A Defense of Free Grace. This paper will explain, when necessary, why the view that the audience believers is preferred, that the audience is comprised, that the audience is believers is preferred. It's probably the audience are believers, or I don't know. I'll figure it out later. This had to be said lest the free grace position is shown from the text and then merely dismissed by the claim that there's no evidence that they're saved. Here are some reasons for believing that Paul only addresses. And I'm just going to put a note here. Note concerning falsifiability. And I'm just going to color it to remind me to go back in and to add that. Paul is a prophet, and he writes when divinely inspired. It is doubtful when Paul tells the Thessalonians that they are the sons of light, that what he means is they merely are, that they merely appear, that they merely appear to be sons of light. This phrase in context indicates a positional truth about the audience. Do I need to explain positional truth early on? I have to talk about that. For those that object, claiming that Paul could not see people's motives, so he could not know if they were saved, contradicts his inspired viewpoint in the book of Philippians. He knows the motives of those preaching Christ. So I need to insert verses here. That's where he says some preach Christ, in order to cause me harm or whatever. The social context of 1 Corinthians differs from a preacher talking to a mixed group. The book of Acts records that Crispus, the synagogue's leader, believed in the Lord, his household, and many other Corinthians. So the Acts is telling us they're believers. So the Corinthians are saved. He calls them saints, which at least means that they are saved. Even the ESV commentary that claims people are only addressed as saved, only addressed as saved, but are not actually saved, or not necessarily saved, would be what I would say, but are not necessarily saved, says their present status is as saints, or Pisa, I didn't spell that right, but I'll fix it later, who believes salvation can be a loss, agrees that they are saved. After they are saved, Paul ministered to them for 18 months. So I'm giving different arguments for why, person should believe that the Corinthians are saved. So here's the three basic interpretive possibilities of key terms. So you got save, gospel, stand, hold fast, believe, vein, and passages where I might put them. And you see how they all run together. And I may put this up forward. I may move it. I don't know exactly where I'm going to put it, but okay. So here's the first question after asking if they're believers. What does save mean in 1 Corinthians 15? In the above discussion, the reader had assumed that when the word save occurred, it referred to positional salvation. But what does save mean in the context of this passage? Paul begins this chapter by discussing the gospel, modified by 4 relative clauses. The last clause is by which you are saved. When one encounters the word group for salvation, it is helpful to ask saved from what to determine its contextual meaning. The word itself means to deliver, rescue, or preserve. This is a good place to invoke the categories often called the 3 tenses of salvation. Because grammatical tenses are not the only basis for this, categorizing the phrase 3 aspects is preferred. The 3 positional, experiential, and ultimate aspects modify any word or concept. In any context, Paul can refer to positional, experiential, and ultimate salvation. Some sociological positions either blur these distinctions or make assumptions about the relationship of these parts to each other. Some use different words, but more important is the concept behind the words. As visualized in the above chart, there are three main options for what saved means in this passage. I don't need to say that again. So I just... Positional salvation cannot be used by those who believe one can lose their position in Christ. First salvation would work for them. This should actually say initial salvation. Initial salvation. I-N-T-I-L. That's not spelled right. I'll get it later though. Initial salvation would work for them. Ultimate salvation is vague if one does not understand that position guarantees ultimate and that does not guarantee ultimate glorification should be what it says. Guarantees ultimate glorification, and that experiential does not determine one's destination. Other terms before save help identify what type of salvation is in view addressed below. This leads some to say salvation can be lost, and others argue that a person that does not continue in the gospel is not truly saved. Some believe that final salvation will not come without perseverance. Okay. Now, one of the issues that I'm having is that when I was writing this paper, I inserted notes in, and I honestly don't remember where they're from. So there's some places where it's like, did I write that? If it's using my language, I know I wrote that, but like there's a 19 here. So I'm thinking this 19 goes there. So that's a footnote, and I'll talk about footnotes later. So this is clearly me because it's using my language. Rather than positional salvation, this is an example of experiential salvation. This relative clause beginning with by which indicates the gospel is the way, the instrument, or the basis for experiential salvation. Yeah, that's me. That's a summary. Ultimate salvation is also in view since the resurrected body is in context. That is when all parts of salvation, it should be aspects of salvation are complete. It's more than one. So moving on now, what does gospel mean in 1 Corinthians 15? Since the passage under consideration refers to experiential salvation, this will influence the understanding of other concepts. The relative clause that includes this experiential sanctification truth is changing the word gospel. It should be not changing, it's modifying the word gospel, which leads one to ask, what is the gospel in this passage? The word gospel is typically defined by its Greek etymology as good news, but like all words, context contributes most to meaning. The Septuagint translates several Hebrew words for it, but the main idea is message or report. So the meaning of the word in our passage can be arrived at by asking, what is the message or good news Paul is talking about? There is a positional message, an experiential message, and an ultimate message. Is this a gospel about how one becomes positionally saved? Is this gospel about how one is experientially sanctified? Is this a gospel about how one will be ultimately glorified? Most Christians assume that 1 Corinthians 15 is the gospel about how to get saved from hell. But if this passage refers to experiential sanctification, then here, I need to highlight this because this is seems to be tied to my thesis. But if this passage refers to experiential salvation, then the experiential gospel message may be in view. Since the context includes all three aspects of salvation, the context may also include all three aspects of the gospel. Support for the positional gospel includes mentioning the death, burial, and resurrection. Support for the experiential gospel consists of the experiential use of salvation, and support for the ultimate gospel includes the bodily resurrection in the same context. The social context also supports the options because they're believers. That's what that means. In 1 Corinthians 15, I probably need to elaborate on that. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul focuses on the truth that Christians will be resurrected bodily because some doubt they will be resurrected due to their baggage. This passage is not counting their denial of Christ's resurrection. It addresses the believers' denial that they will rise bodily. They're saying there's no resurrection for them. This is about dead bodies. These are just truncated statements for me to go back and look at these. They were placeholders for me to say, okay, if I want to go back and look at the commentary where I quoted it from, I can, and clarify how I want to articulate it. So they're just short, pithy statements summarizing that. Constable does not think this is an issue. So somehow Constable differs from what I was saying here. And so I may have to talk about that. About the background for this passage. These Gentile believers' baggage include their unbelief that there's a bodily resurrection. They also have a wrong view of spirituality, and Paul consists of a doctrinal essay for a reason. It's not consists, it's Paul includes a doctrinal essay for a reason. So this chapter in 1 Corinthians 15 is like a doctrinal essay. Anyway, Paul preached the gospel to them and they believed. He then cites what he first taught them, including the message about Christ's substitutionary death, burial, and resurrection. But the context he gives goes beyond that. Paul focuses on Christ's resurrection and appearances to remind his audience what they believe. They think Jesus was resurrected, but they do not believe that they will resurrect. Paul is pointing out how illogical that is. So even if gospel is positional, it includes many things unnecessary for salvation. I guess you could say for positional salvation. Paul wants them to see how the message has implications for experiential sanctification. Therefore, Paul focuses on the experiential message, but gets there by hammering the ultimate message of the resurrection. The first of the four relative clauses that change gospel is that modify, not change. That modified gospel is I preach to you, and I think it should be which I preach to you, but the gospel was proclaimed euangelisamein to them. The relative clause function in this way. The second relative clause modifying gospel is which you receive. They have also received paralabate, this gospel, which means they accepted it. Some people think it received a synonym for believing the gospel, but that is not the case here or possibility in any place. This describes how they, plural, received this doctrinal point, but now they may not let go, but they now may let go of that point. This is like Galatians 1, where the same verb received is used. What about corporate acceptance? So these are some of my questions that I have when I'm still fleshing this out. What does stand mean in 1 Corinthians 15? The third relative clause modifying gospel is in which you also stand. They also stand as stakete in this gospel. This may indicate sphere. This is the foundation. Does this refer to one's positional, experiential, or ultimate standing? Scripture talks about all three, but here this probably refers to experiential standing, as they were currently standing in or on the gospel where Paul wrote the letter to them. Representatives from all camps will agree. Some think standing can be lost. Others think one could pretend to be standing, or they could be deceived into thinking that they are standing. Those who think that standing can be lost attribute that to apostasy, perpetual carnality, or something in between. Those that think one could pretend to have standing have more ground to stand on because it's possible for a person to be an infiltrator, meaning they never believe the gospel. But those that stress this professor, not possessor paradigm, it's probably all hyphened here, professor, but not possessor paradigm, typically claim one does not have because their call to salvation was inadequate. Non-efficacious, maybe the term may be used. I don't know. This is where they redefine faith or claim that emotional, volitional elements must be sufficiently engaged for a person to be truly saved. Those that think a person is deceived into thinking they're standing argue for spurious faith, temporary faith, or non-efficacious gospel. Some believers who think one's standing can be lost may claim it is only by choosing to no longer believe in Jesus. The context describes their current standing in the gospel. Is initial faith a good category? It'd probably be a better category than positional faith. If gospel concerns the resurrection, and what I mean by this is that a person believes you can lose your salvation, they can only talk about initial faith. They can't talk about positional faith because position cannot be lost. If gospel concerns the resurrection, they're standing in the message Paul taught about the resurrection and now teaches about the implications related to the believer. They can agree or disagree. So I got some other passages here. The Corinthians Christians are still standing. I think this is a reference to word studies for standing that I could plug in later. Since the text emphasizes a present standing, not surprisingly, the fourth clause modifies the gospel as you are being saved. The gospel is also by what they are being saved, so says they, since it is present passive. What does it mean to hold fast into 1 Corinthians 15? If a conditional clause did not follow the fourth relative clause modifying gospel, it would be much easier to view this passage as purely positional. This conditional clause is not a hypothetical condition. The hypotheticals are introduced later in the chapter. It is a first-class condition. So let us assume that if they hold fast to the gospel, they do not believe in vain. Unless they believe in vain. I got to clarify because my editors messed that up. After thoroughly addressing the holding fast, more will be said about what vain means. So what I'm saying here is that whenever it says, and let's assume for the sake they're arguing that they do believe in vain, after thoroughly expressing holding fast, more will be said about what vain means. The concept of holding fast probably should not be used to describe positional salvation because God's faithfulness holds on to the believer that guarantees eternal security. No one would say that holding fast, not false, refers to the ultimate because one no longer has sin in their glorified body. But because some people view salvation as only a process that must be continued until one's death or translation, they understand holding fast as the means of being saved. But holding fast refers to something saved people are doing, and what they're holding on to is the gospel. They will not be holding fast if they stop believing or behaving correctly. What does the conditional clause mean? How does it relate to the conditional clause? Is this teaching perseverance? What does vain mean here? So these are our interpretive questions. A conditional relative clause follows that says if you hold fast to the word which we proclaimed, taking a stand on the gospel differs from having to stand on the gospel to remain saved. Holding fast here may refer to keeping the gospel in their mind. They received and believed, so they stand firm and look back to the saving gospel. Hold fast to traditions. Another condition is given when it says, unless they believed in vain. What does it mean to believe? How is believe being used here? A working definition in harmony with this passage is that faith belief is mentally assenting to supernatural facts. This goes beyond the historical facts that can be known from extra-biblical sources to what is revealed in Scripture. Jesus died for sin. This does not merely refer to his physical death. His substitutionary spiritual death is in view. When one believes these supernatural facts about propitiation, that one is positionally saved. This can be described as positional belief. If this passage saying that unless you positionally believed in vain, and what makes that in vain? Are all the above questions culminating in discussing the meaning of vain in 1 Corinthians 15? Does vain here mean? So what does believing in vain mean in context? Does vain here mean no purpose or no concern? Is it vain because it's untrue or because they never truly believed? Why do some say the first option does not fit the context in which the issue is the bodily resurrection, which they believe is not true? This would not be hypothetical because they could not have believed this, but was still saved. Because they could not have believed this, but were still saved. So while hypotheticals do not show until 12 through 19, those hypotheticals could explain why they should not believe in vain. How does the second option relate to the immediate and broader literary context? So I see that I have a lot of questions here. I don't have a lot of explanation here, so I'm going to have to answer these a little bit better. Is Paul assuring them of their salvation and warning them that they're not saved, believed in vain? How does this relate to perishing? What does Kistermaker say here? What about Schreiner? So those are placeholders for those commentary. These 5 commas that occur in these 2 verses give one idea. The primary meaning of the recurring elements is as follows. These relate to each other and provide illumination. What does this occur? What are the implications? Believe is a constative aorist. It is not a false faith. It is a faith with no purpose. Vain is an adverb. Galatians 3, James 1:19-24. Being saved, and they do not, and they do that by receiving the word. These are just notes. What is the purpose of 1 Corinthians 15? The purpose of 1 Corinthians 15 is to argue for the truth of the bodily resurrection, to correct the Corinthian Christians so that they will experience resurrection power and be useful instead of vain. What are the similarities between Romans 6 and this passage? What are the connection between the 2 books? Are they written from Corinth? Identify the audience as believers. Finally, counter the objections to such claims. Is ultimate salvation more acceptable than final salvation? Is Paul, who's pale, saying their initial faith was in vain if they do not remain in the faith? What does this do with grace? What must this do with commitment? What must this, and it shouldn't be what must this do? What does this have to do with? But my editor changed it. What must this do with commitment? What must this have to do with accountability? What is the rhetorical structure? What is the proposito? What is the refutio confessional formula? And so I got some notes for the Greek, other stuff I'm integrating, just moving forward. Most believe in the resurrection of Christ. Paul was at Corinth for 18 months and they fell into spiritism when he left. So Paul corrects them. This has several implications. It also has assumptions. The structure and argument of this chapter are as follows. Then Paul talks about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The pericope is 1 Greek paragraph with the 2 verses being 1 Greek sentence indicate one idea. So I'm just preserving some structure stuff here. Summarize how the chapter begins. And so here's some more notes. An ecclesia is formed as Paul writes in 1 and 11 of what was preached and received belief. He summarized the facts. Specific application to the resurrection in verse 13-14. Salvation cannot be lost, but it can be pointless, and the danger in denying it. Another way to put it, 15:1-2, introduction, 15:13-19, historical realities of resurrection, 15:20-28, impact of resurrection and angelic conflict in human history, 15:29-34, the implication of Christ's resurrection, and 15:35-38, answer questions regarding the resurrection. So, as you see, I got a lot more things to do. I think my next step to do is to think about the connection between, my footnotes. Like, we'll just do one, for example. Does one have to continue to believe and behave in harmony with the gospel and remain saved, or prove that one is truly saved? So this footnote is saying those that think one must continue to remain saved are typically called Arminian. Those that think one must continue to prove you are saved are typically called Calvinists. These categories are no longer helpful. Some prefer the term conditionalist versus unconditionalist. But if unconditionalist is another term for eternal security, then it does not distinguish traditionalists and provisionists from the main view within free grace theology. So this is just me trying to define terms with that first point. And so ideally what I would like to do is I want to get all the Greek stuff in the bottom of the footnotes. That reads better, but I don't know if I'll be able to do that. So yeah, I'm going to try to do a little bit of work on this paper in between the time I finish this video and do the next one. That way, whenever I come back, I could show you what I did work on and how I worked on it. So anyway, if you were blessed by this video, subscribe, hit the bell if you want notifications, give us a thumbs up for the algorithm purpose, share it with others if you think people were blessed by it. And if you want to contribute to the Layman's Seminary, if God's blessed you through it, there's a PayPal link and underneath most of my videos. And please keep this ministry in prayer. God bless.